So I'm gonna step through this. It's very short compared to what we've had previously. It's not like 20, 30 slides, but I thought this would be a nice little topic to discuss and to get feedback on. So this is actually a slide that was going to be part of part of the core gameplay loop slide, but I thought it was relevant anyway to just sort of leave in, have a bit of a reminder of where we are so far for those who are joining in this conversation. Perhaps they been on holiday for the last couple of weeks or haven't been following the discussion as thoroughly. But in terms of where we have refined sailing right now, we decided to tackle navigation first. We released a really cool demo that showed how gameplay would work on the ship, produced by the engine team during their game jam. They decided they wanted to tackle this and see how great they could make it, just sort of on the side, fun. And we were blown away, and we decided that this is exactly the direction we want to go with sailing, and it is, in all honesty, it was the developers' sort of perfect vision of sailing anyway. The idea that you have this set of coordinates that are superimposed on another set of coordinates, and it just kind of felt very cool, real, and old school. We also covered in the navigation mechanics refinement our definition of small, large, and colossal ships, how they work and differ from each other. We touched on some navigation variables like sailing speed and turning speed. We touched on some navigational mechanics such as wind and current, and also addressed topics such as the world map and scale. And I think our response to what everyone has said so far, or sort of our perception, is that it was very well received. We were planning to action a bunch of feedback on each stage of these refinement, but we really didn't feel like there was any clear feedback to action. Sure, some things were a bit more subjective, and we're obviously aware that we're talking at a design level now, and things might change if this moves into development or over time. But from this stage of the skill pitch, we just felt like it was very solid. The tech demo did a really good job of explaining it and sort of showing people exactly the vision that we were describing. And then just the fact that we went with the interacting with stuff on a ship, just we got a lot of praise for that feeling very old school, as opposed to maybe a more gamified approach of turning you into a ship, which was upon a possibility until we saw the engine tech demo. But one of the things that has been prevalent since the navigation refinement discussion is that just burning, lingering question. Is sailing a skill or a mini game? How exactly am I going to earn XP? In fact, we had so many people still saying, you should cover this first. I can't believe this isn't obvious for sailing. How have we gone months after hearing about the sailing pitch and we still haven't answered that question? And to me, I think that this is actually quite a complicated topic. It challenges the very fabric of what is a skill in old school RuneScape, what is important for a skill. So I thought that that's what this presentation is about, for a little bit of a Mod Husky ramble into delving into this kind of topic. So yeah, moving on to the next slide. So I think that here are a couple of definitions of a skill versus a minigame. They're taken from the old school RuneScape wiki. There isn't really a hard, fast definition. You could look at the definition of a skill in real life. That's not really going to translate well to a game because things are gamified. And a minigame isn't a concept that is consistent from game to game or like outside of our game. Or it's not consistent like what that is as a term in real life either. But what we can do is just look at an example of how the old school RuneScape wiki have defined it. And they've said that a skill is a player's attributes that can be advanced throughout the game. Skills are trained by repeating actions that give experience in the skill until enough experience is earned to advance to the next level. Seems pretty straightforward. A minigame, small games in which players or teams of players set out to complete a certain objective. These games usually allow players to gain experience and/or items. And there's already a bit of an overlap there. Does this mean that a skill cannot be trained by teams of players? There's certainly an activity that players participate in. Sometimes in skills there is an objective. Slayer very much gives you an objective of slaying a Slayer creature. And minigames allowing players to gain experience, well, skilling definitely allows you to gain experience. There's definitely some overlap in the definition between skill and minigame, and I think that's where a lot of the discussion has sort of come from, with players being on different sides of the argument. Is sailing a skill? No, it's a minigame. No, it's a skill, and that kind of thing. Looking at some of the skills, I feel like I'm teaching your granny how to suck eggs with some of this, but I figured I might as well be thorough with this. We do have 4 categories of skills. Gathering skills, obviously skills that involve obtaining resources or items from the environment. Production skills involve processing items obtained from gathering skills into finished products. I think that's an important distinction. It's not just about the core gameplay loop of production. It is literally about the fact that you're turning something from gathering into a product. I think that is something that is sometimes missed in a definition of production. Combat are skills that involve fighting in combat, pretty self-explanatory. And utility skills are skills that do not share a cohesive theme, but usually reward the player with a variety of benefits. Again, these definitions were taken from the wiki. It's a bit of a copy-paste. But it does utility skills are definitely an outlier here, right? They're not consistent between each other, and just saying they reward the player with benefits is vague in and of itself. Utility skill is something that we are pitching sailing to be. Utility skills, just by their nature, are complex. They are harder to define than gathering and production, and they tend to be more versatile. We have 5 skills that are defined as utility skills in game. Fire making is kind of like a production skill, but with no product. The only reason you're doing it is to provide a temporary benefit that is objectively not that useful in a temporary place you can cook from. Agility is a truly unique utility skill. I don't think there's another skill that's quite like it, but shortcuts really are a niche reward. There isn't much incentive to train it outside of those shortcuts. Stamina potions make the sort of run energy obsolete, and once you get past 50, 60, you don't really see a very good return on your time investment into the skill. Construction is also kind of like a production skill in terms of the resources that you use from gathering kind of being turned into something, but it's not a tradable product, which is usually true for production. Flat packs do exist, they're just not really a thing that is used. But the focus on construction seems to be all about the rewards and quality of life. I think quality of life is something, and the sort of creation of a personal space was a very important thing for it on launch, but it's definitely been power crept over the last several years in old school RuneScape with more and more quality of life and more powerful features. So much so that I feel like construction really is just a means to an end to get those quality of life improvements. Slayer is kind of like a combat skill. I mean, they're trained in almost exactly the same way. The only distinction is that you've been assigned to kill it by a Slayer creature, and the XP is awarded on death. And it also has a reward system that's very much like a minigame. And I say that because there are a lot of perks in Slayer that are awarded purely by you gamifying a process to earn points based on your task streak and which Slayer Master you do. In another world, Slayer might have given you the ability to automatically smash gargoyles by just having smashed a ton of gargoyles, like if you've done it manually, or perhaps just maybe at the level to kill the Slayer creature +5, you now gain that perk. That would have been a way of saying a player has become better at Slayer and earned that perk, but instead it's just I spend points earned by doing this. That itself feels very mini-gamey, but it's kind of in a weird utility space. Thieving is kind of like a gathering skill. The only difference is that it's not really about resources that are turned into production elements. It's just about earning wealth and money and through NPCs and chests. And the sort of loot is very varied. Like, arguably, you could thieve from a gem stall, and that can feed into crafting, kind of. But like, that's not really about thieving's identity. It's just about it's literally just selling like a dream and a vision of being a thief and what that would look like in old school RuneScape. But yeah, very gathering skill-ish. Very click-intensive gathering skill. It's not like clicking on a tree and an instant on thieving for the next 30 seconds. And I think one of the problems with sailing, at least from the pitch level, is that when you hear sailing, it's a very complex idea that doesn't have an obvious set of repeatable actions or something that players refer to as a core gameplay loop. Some players have sort of filled in the blanks and gone, is it moving on the sea? Like just as if I was running to places as a boat or on a boat? Or is it completing tasks like Slayer? Is it doing agility courses at sea?
I think there's just a lot of confusion, and the term sailing doesn't give an inherently obvious answer to those that hear it. And I think that that's something that shamanism and taming both did better at a pitch level. Gathering and production were elements of shamanism. It was sort of selling itself as a skill that combined elements of both. Gathering and production are just very well described and defined concepts in old school, unlike the plethora of utility skills that I've just described. And I just think that that just meant players instinctually knew how they were getting XP and how they were trading. And while taming is a utility skill, it was already kind of had a relation close to Hunter that players were pointing out. You're interacting with creatures in the game world. But I think the truth is that taming sadly just wasn't spoken about all that much. Players were talking about shamanism and sailing and pointing out the flaws and benefits of them more so than taming. So I think that unfortunately it didn't get a deep analysis from the players, but I do think that it was just a bit more inherently easy to understand. The idea, I tame a pet and I get XP for taming a pet. I train a pet, cool, now I get experience from whatever that training is. Moving on. Looking at our existing utility skills, one thing they do have is, I gave a description already, but they do have a concise way of defining all the content in the skill, no matter what. So something to start off as a base that can then be sort of extended upon. Fire making is lighting a log on fire. Thieving is pickpocketing an NPC or stealing from an entity like a chest or stall. Agility is clicking on agility obstacles or shortcuts. Construction is building furniture in your player house. And Slayer is defeating an NPC assigned to you by a Slayer master. All of these activities clearly line up with their name in what you would expect when you hear the skill by its name alone. And aside from Slayer, which is, like, while Slayer is a word in English, it's not really a term we use as a job title for someone, like you're a Slayer. It is really a sort of idea that's been gamified and made as sort of a game concept, like sort of just a made-up thing in old school RuneScape. But all of the others have like a real-life skill as a base to build upon. That just kind of feels natural when you see it in the game. Moving on. Talking about a skill, we've kind of covered like gameplay loops and how utility skills and gameplay loops work. But progression is also a very important part of a skill. And you can't just have gameplay loops alone. You need to feel like as you are training the skill throughout it, there's just that reason. You feel like you're getting better at it. It's all meaningful. Progression is the reason you're gaining XP for the most part. I know that just simply being 99 can be the reward for a lot of players. But most of the time, there are unlocks along the way. You're training to your skill to a certain level to be able to complete a certain quest, to complete a task on an achievement diary, or to be able to do content within the skill itself. Progression done well in a skill should feel meaningful. Gameplay should feel different at level 1 than at 99. A complete novice Slayer is fighting like really simple creatures. It's something Slayer does well, and then you unlock these big bad bosses. They're very engaging gameplay. It really extends the idea from click a monster and wait until it dies to more engaging pieces of content. And some skills are better at this than others. Fire making is notoriously bad. The idea you don't really feel like you're a better fire maker just because the logs are higher tier. The content is very similar. And gathering and production skills just generally don't offer a lot of diversity here. Maybe that's part of the identity of a gathering and production skill, that it's just simple things scaled up. I think that with shamanism, we were trying to get at something more complex. But for the purpose of this discussion in progression, I think we would just try and focus a lot on utility at this point. But yeah, summarizing this kind of progression slide, progression is important and includes staggered unlocks from 1 to 99, a natural escalation in the activities that are being done, and meaningful rewards and incentives to train. Sailing already has an interesting premise from this out of the get-go. The idea of getting access to larger ships, gaining access to new content, or being able to sail across waters that you previously couldn't, or even just gaining access to new activities at sea, is something that we've already seen as a strong positive for sailing and something that players have grafted to. It really does show that the core gameplay loop is something that needs answering, and progression is already there as a solid idea and thing that players understand. Moving on, something that we've discussed a lot internally is designing a skill in 2023. Oh, wow. Slide title. Let's say, what is a skill 2023's design? Until I copy pasted my slides. Anyway, 2023 skill design. Most skills that were introduced at the time in old school RuneScape were just introduced through their most basic forms on the skill launch. And over time, as the old school RuneScape team, we've made them progressively more complex through additional updates. Player expectations in 2023 are substantially higher than they were back in the day. And I say back in the day as to back when we were playing maybe as kids and didn't really, put much thought into what a skill should be. I think that we're all substantially more well-educated than we were back then. And we mostly just train skills for the rewards. Like I said, we weren't too analytical or critical of the journey. We knew when things were fun or when things weren't. There were definitely favorite skills and not favorite skills, or definitely still trends where players might have, not trained runecraft, despite the fact that we also thought that running essence to people at altars was really good money making when we were just training runecraft for other people back in the day. But over the time, as a development team, we've realized that sometimes just the most simple part of gameplay doesn't work. Players have responded very well to the idea of making skills more complex or introducing additional content with skills over time. And sometimes the content that we're addressing is just sort of to look at key issues or to make gameplay more engaging and fun. The added complexity that I'm describing about 2023 skill design and what we're trying to accomplish isn't something that's unique to sailing either. With shamanism, we were already moving past the gathering production elements and talking about the spirit world and the additional benefits and the way that it sort of interacts with the world. And with taming, we were considering things like pet raids and dungeons and combat capabilities and how that would work with pets beyond just simply taming them and having them do things for you in the world. So while this isn't something that we've necessarily outlined until now, our approach as for developing a skill in 2023 is to do both of these things. We need to define a core gameplay loop. That is very important to the identity of a skill. But we should also create content that uses the core gameplay loop as a base and expands on it to make the journey from 1 to 99 more fun and interesting than just that simple repeated loop all the way for hundreds of hours. That said, we're not saying that we want to release a skill in this year in this day and age that is finished. No skill should ever be finished, and we should absolutely leave room for progression in the future. We're just hoping to build something that is more fleshed out and engageable than a skill might have traditionally been released back in the day. So, summarizing this entire point, these 8 to 9 slides that I've done, in order for sailing to be defined as a skill and not a minigame, to us, it must have the following: a clear and simple core gameplay loop, i.e. a set of actions that can be repeatedly done to earn experience. Like that is required. Optionally, we can also introduce a set of activities that are extensions to that core gameplay that enhance the content and leveling experience beyond what the core gameplay loop is. However, as a development team, we do believe that this should be part of the initial launch, like that this shouldn't be optional. It should also offer a clear progression system that offers both unlocks and progression all the way from 1 to 99 that naturally show improvement in the skill for the player character, that sort of natural escalation of content. And it should also offer rewards and incentive to train the skill. We don't want to introduce a skill that is just no reason to train except for the joy of doing the activity. We do know that players are generally more rewards incentivized in this day and age. And then finally, while we need unlocks, progression, and rewards,
we should make sure that they are all meaningful and thematically fitting sailing's identity. All of the unlocks, rewards, and progression should feel like they're connected to sailing and not there just to artificially add goals that are not sailing related. So yeah, that's it.
Great job, Husky. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. I'm not sure if we wanted to take questions or if we just wanted to chat for a little bit. I know you have to leave in about half an hour or relatively soon.
But yeah, I don't know. I hope people found that interesting. I think that as a development team, we strongly believe that what we're pitching with sailing is a skill. And we've seen the it's just a mini game thing come up a lot. I think that there's a lot that goes into that discussion and what makes it complex. I think that there are elements of dungeoneering that is often brought up as an example that definitely made it feel very mini-gamey, being very tied to a specific part of the world, and absolutely mandatorily required other skills to do it, and all these things. It had a very convoluted sort of points reward shop based system. I think none of these individually necessarily make something feel like a mini game, but I think when you have a large amount of the content that's being talked about that has mini game like components sort of at the forefront, it's sort of like a ratio where 20% skill, 80% mini game is going to feel very mini game. Like 80% skill and 20% mini game is still going to feel like a skill. So we believe as a development team that sailing is absolutely a skill in the game and fits the utility skill description and can have interesting progression systems that make it feel like a skill. And all of our focus is on making sailing itself a fun and integrated part of the game and not just a means to an end to unlock islands and bosses on the other side of it. There's a lot of our design philosophy that's going into that identity of sailing. And I hope that when we release the core gameplay loop stuff in a week or so from now, I hope that will come across to players and they'll sort of remember the points that I've sort of brought up here and sort of see how that is being directly incorporated.
Yeah, and to reiterate as well, I saw some people in the chat asking, like, I still don't feel like this is a skill, and the fact that they haven't been talking about core gameplay yet worries me. We want to assure you guys that we will be talking about the core gameplay loop. We just need a bit more time to refine it and make sure that it's up to the standard that we want it to be before you guys can give your feedback on it. That's our main concern, is we don't want to present something to you that is too overwhelming or doesn't have enough information in certain areas. We want to make sure that's perfect. I do have a question for you, Husky. So as someone that created the Sepulchre, which is a really well-regarded piece of content, how do you feel when people make associations to sailing being like water sepulchre? Like, do you feel happy about that? Do you feel nervous about that? How does it make you feel?
I mean, I think there's two sides to it. There's obviously the part that's like people likening it to agility is boring, moving a ship is boring. Sepulchre made agility fun, so let's do Sepulchre at sea and that'll make sailing fun, right? As like an analogy, I mean, I obviously like that. I enjoy that people do enjoy the content of Sepulchre. That's the reason I am in this job, is to create content that people enjoy doing, and we look back and go, yeah, that was a blast. I'm really glad they added that to the game. But I think the terms like Sepulchre at sea is just, I think it's hard for me to think about what that means, because I think the player motivation is saying, make something more intricate, more complex, that rewards more precise actions. But I'm also aware that we have a portion of the player base that wants to enjoy sailing without having to feel like, they're drawing Venn diagrams and charts and mapping out literally everything to this really complex level. A part of a skill that makes it good is that it can appeal to a lot of players and can have layers of optional complexity or steps that players can do to get additional benefit, but not feel necessarily required as part of the skill. Sepulchre isn't everyone's cup of tea. Some people look at this and go, oh, it's really complex content, I'm just going to stick to rooftops because I enjoy just mindlessly, clicking around the rooftop, maybe on mobile or doing something else or on the side while watching Netflix content. I think that's something that we strive to do a lot in our game, is offer these variety of training methods. But if people are talking more literally about Sepulchre Unseen, I'm not really sure if players are talking about the dodging of obstacles that are coming at your ship, and if you get hit by them, you teleport back to a safe spot. I mean, I'm sure we could introduce a variety of sailing, like themed pieces of content that had navigational challenges and required very tight mastery of precision of your ship. But I don't think that that's something that should be included as like a from the get-go part of sailing.
So more like a additional activity or training method rather than the only training method. Is that kind of where you're getting at?
Yeah, it's something where like something that'll come up a lot in our core gameplay blog is where we talk about layers of content, where I kind of touched on it here, where a Slayer boss is a natural extension of a Slayer creature, and so is a superior Slayer creature. There's like an intermediate step where you've got this initial gameplay loop that has this thing attached to it that fits the identity of the skill and makes the skill more complex. And they're not required to train the skill, but there are additional layers that can go onto it. So if there were players who felt like, I'm really going to enjoy customizing a ship, building it for speed, building it for good maneuverability, and I want to navigate this piece of terrain really precisely, I think that would be a cool piece of content as an option available for those players. I don't think that should be like strictly what the skill is about. If that makes sense.
You. Someone asked, since we're not approaching core gameplay today, what sort of feedback is going to be useful next week? From my perspective, it comes down to, number one, do you like what we're presenting to you? Do you like the content? And number two, what do you like the most and what do you like the least? Like, what needs changing? So the idea is we present the core gameplay loop to you. We present a number of training methods. We give you more detail on how you can expect to train the skill, what kind of intensity and XP levels that we're looking at, and just let us know what you like and what you don't like, so we can take it from there, really. A lot of what we're looking at as well, is just about presentation of the information. So we need to present that in a way that makes sense and is easily digestible for every kind of player, which is what we're looking at now.
It's also like a lot more than that. Like, where we're at with the core gameplay is that we're very happy with it. And we had a lot of people asking questions internally, sort of saying things like, okay, so I'm going to set out for today and I'm going to train sailing. What might that journey look like for me if I'm going to chase optimal experience rates? Or what might that journey look like for me if I'm just interested in exploring the ocean? What might that journey look like for me if I'm looking to obtain new resources? And I think that we want to make sure we've got scenarios like that that really truly describe the player's journey and experience logging in to do the content, at least our vision of it. It's really hard because we're talking about things at a design level that are like, here's the direction we believe this should go in, here are some concrete things that we do believe, but it can be very hard to know like what specific types of content players are exactly going to want to go into the game. There's absolutely going to be parts of sailing that will need to be pulled after the green light, like, hey, we've got this content addition idea for sailing. Here's a description of it, more thoroughly thought out. Now that we've got time to look at this specific activity, would you like this in the game? And we could absolutely get a lot of feedback on, oh yeah, I really like this one, I don't like that one as much, and get a feel for the community and the sorts of activities that they would like to do. A big part of sailing's sort of allure to players, and what we're really hyped about as well, is that it's opening up a dimension of the game world that players have just never really been able to access outside of just sort of, we're going to fake it by showing an overlay of a ship moving and you're just really teleporting from A to B with a delay. So naturally, gaining access to the sea comes with this really fun, interesting sort of expansion of content and new dimension that content can exist in. So while those things might not be necessarily directly tied to, ooh, this is a sailing training activity, it still feels like we want to have activities at sea that players can do as a result of having train sailing.
Absolutely. Got a question. These are kind of like, I'm not sure whether we can answer them at this stage, but it's highly upvoted. So, how do you feel about underwater content as a feature of sailing, either at release or post-release, if it were to pass?
I really like the idea of underwater content. I'm not sure what form it would take. Like, for example, would we create hotspots at sea that you can dive down into, and there's like little pockets of water, and this is like, say, like as if you dived off the sea at from Murphy and Port Gazar, like for the crab quest. Do we just make like a map zone 64 by 64 tiles that's like, oh cool, that's what this hotspot took you to, and what content would be down there? I think that the underwater content feels quite clunky to move around in for players right now, as far as like, unless they've got flippers, they can't run, and there's all that overlay. I think that there's a lot of nitty-gritty details players might get into, as far as, oh, they want to include underwater content. Well, I don't like how current underwater content is implemented. And that's something I can't really comment on, as far as I don't know if we did include underwater comment, would we implement it like the rest of the content for consistency? Do we think that current implementation fits the purpose of what we're trying to achieve? Doesn't need some fine-tuning and up? And if we did fine-tune the underwater experience to be better, is that something that we can bring back to the rest of the game world as well? I mean, already, just on that topic, it's not something I've really thought about. I know we've discussed underwater content a little bit internally, but already that train of thought made me think, like, ooh, what if, like, you going underwater was like a part of a content that was unlocked as part of sailing, and then sailing because you're at sea, and being able to like interact with water is kind of like a part of like the content that we're releasing. What if we, like, once you get to a certain sailing level, or you do this thing for someone that's related to sailing content, you get this unlock or ability that you can take back to the rest of underwater content. Like, that's already got me thinking about how this can feed back into other stuff. This is just a wild Husky tangent on like how stuff like this could theoretically be integrated.
I've got a really good question here from Chris, which is like, I've never seen it as a minigame, but my main concern is that sailing could feel more like a content expansion rather than something that has to be tied to a skill. Is the progression system the main drive behind it feeling more like a skill? Or like, what is it that we think that makes like sailing stand apart as a skill rather than a content expansion, which is a big topic.
Yeah, I've seen this topic come up a lot, and I've put a lot of thought into it. It's something that you really have to dig down and think. What would sailing look like if it was released as a content expansion instead of a skill? So already I'm thinking, okay, so the progression to moving to different boats, is that just something you automatically have access to, or is it unlocked? If it is unlocked, how are we unlocking it without having a skill system? You could probably look into things like a series of quests, or some sort of meta faction sort of, earning sort of reputation or something with the Dockmaster, similar to like Zaya Favor, but like obviously probably better gameplay than Zaya Favor, to eventually gain access to it. Maybe there's this overlay system like that. And then what about the content at sea, or the actual upgrading of the ship? How are we tying that into it? Because like, you could still use your other skills to like craft stuff on the ship, but how are we gating that? Are we gating it purely behind, say, your crafting or construction level? In which case, there's a lot of players who are just instantly going to be able to get the best stuff on the best ship as long as they've unlocked it, or maybe even immediately if there's no unlock at all. I think there's a lot of charming content being a skill on launch, because it sets people back to level 1. Like, it's that idea of introducing a new magic-like skill, or introducing a spell book. You introduce a new spell book, and that's cool because there's this all reward space. But players can already summon thralls after getting Arceus spellbook, despite never having done any quote-unquote necromancy magic in the game, right? Whereas if that was introduced as a necromancy skill, you would have a more sort of staggered progression system, and feeling like I'm getting better at this aspect of the game. So I think, to me, if sailing was included as part of a content expansion, I would probably have the focus be on the content at sea, and very much less so about the aspect of sailing a ship. The sailing a ship would just be that vehicle to get to content, something that I've described before. And I really do think that cheapens the potential experience for the player. To us, even if sailing could theoretically be done as a content expansion, if you're just looking for the capability to get to islands and to do content on a boat, you're sort of looking at the specific content and not about the journey of learning to sail it and the intricacies of sailing more so. That's just kind of how I feel about that. I think the content is undoubtedly heightened and made better by being a skill. Just like if we introduce, say, Pyramid Plunder, for example, as an activity that was tied completely outside of training, and it was just collecting artifacts from the tombs and bring it back to the mummy, and you unlock level 2 at 2,000 points and level 3 at 3,000 points and stuff. I think it just feels more flat as an idea. I really do think that the excitement of skills and the journey is like such a big allure to me for like introducing a skill into the game at all. I think that too often players have a mindset of reaching the goal, and once I've got the goal, that's it. And all I want is the goal. That's the most important thing. But for me, I've always seen this game as the journey is what's important and not the rewards, right? It's not about getting every item from Chambers of Xeric and every single raid in the game and then logging off because I now have all the items and I have no more goals to get. The journey to getting those items was the fun part. So to me, like that really is what sailing is. It's not about just gaining access to all this content at sea and getting to explore it all as if it's like a big content expansion. It's about that journey progressing through the content. And while you could have these sort of hooks that tie into each other, one content relating to another or a series of quests or something, I do feel like it lessens that experience as a whole.
Great answer. Yeah, I think like in theory a lot of things could work outside of being a skill, but they wouldn't have that added benefit of the types of support, resource, progression that a skill has. So yeah. I've got a question from Cruel, which is about XP drops. I think we might be able to address this later on, but do you imagine the XP drops is going to be single large drops or many small drops or a mix of both? Does it depend on the training method for sailing?
Where was the question? Sorry, I'm just trying to find it.
Just the end. So the last one being asked here.
Oh, XP drops.
Yeah.
Kind of a hard question to answer without sort of giving a sneak peek of core gameplay, really. And I'm very conscious about saying stuff now that can form opinions without having the full context of the document. But what I will say is that it kind of depends on the training method. I think that stuff is always contextually driven based on the training method. We have examples already in game where agility is a good example compared to Sepulcher. You get a bit of agility experience for every obstacle you go through, and then a little bit at the end for completing the course. Whereas Sepulcher is purely just an XP drop at the end of it. And that made sense contextually in that content because there weren't that many hooks to award agility experience in it. I think that something that is more like something that is like a gathering skill makes more sense to reward you whenever you like gather a resource, whereas something that it was like a contract as far as bring me 100 logs makes more sense to reward you at the end for getting 100 logs. But at the same time, like if you were getting XP for every single log along the way, it would put that example as a gathering skill would be more like get like maybe 10, 15, 20 XP per log, and then oh cool, you got 1,000 at the end. So I think that sailing doesn't have a clear answer on whether it will be a large drop or a small drop. I think one of the things people think of when they think of a large drop though is liken it to the original sort of sailing content pitch that was back in the day where it was like, hey, you go out to port and you go on this preset generated adventure and then you come back to port and that is your gameplay session as a whole. And it was just you went out, you did a bunch of stuff, you came back, you got XP at the end based on how well you did. Sort of similar to Dungeoneering's loop. And to me, that necessarily doesn't fit in sailing at all, because our goal is not that you leave port
do a bunch of activities, get no XP, and then come back to port and you're finished. Our goal is to make the sea feel like this big, living, breathing thing with lots of opportunities at sea and lots of options available to the players. Coming back to port is just finishing sailing for the day, right? So to me, why would I want to withhold all your experience until you finished for the day or finished for the session? If there's things you are doing that are sailing related, you should get that XP while you're doing it.
Awesome answer. Do we want to ask people to raise their hands for the last 10 minutes of the sesh? How do you feel?
Sure.
I know you gotta go at
5:30.
Okay, cool. Raise your hands, guys, if you have any questions. Bear in mind, we won't really be able to answer a lot until the core gameplay blog launches. Hopefully, I'm looking at around a week's time, or maybe just over a week. So. Do you have any questions for Husky on what he talked about? What is a skill? The skill versus minigame debate? Anything like that? Raise your hand. We will invite. Do we want Alpha Walrus back? He's just raised his hand. I feel like I remember you. Hi, Alpha.
I'm back, yay.
Welcome back. What's your question?
My question was kind of more just in terms of with the whole, debate that people have with skill versus a minigame. I think a lot of the stuff that I see is that a lot of the content that's come out in the last few years to make some of the skills that people don't like that much be like, oh, well, here's a minigame, and now the skill is fun, Guardians of the Rift or Hollow Sepulchre, all that. So I think a lot of people are like, okay, fun equal minigame. So now that you guys are trying to make a whole new skill in modern day, that you're like, okay, well, we don't want it to be a horrible, the highest you can go is 30k an hour kind of grind that you hate to do, that people are just like, oh, well, then the only way I can think of it being fun is a minigame. Well, I don't want a minigame for a skill, so I don't want it. I was just wondering your thoughts on that.
I think that we've done that a lot with some forms of content. I think there are also examples where we haven't. Herbivore, I wouldn't necessarily define as a minigame, but it was a new hunter method to make that more fun from level 80. I think the viewpoint you're making about players going, oh, if it's too fun, it's a minigame, and if it's boring, it's a skill. And then you've got players saying, well, we want fun, and you've got players going, well, you can't have the fun and it still be a skill. And I think that's a mindset that we're trying to challenge a lot, especially with the what is a skill discussion, because we do have players telling us two different things. Like saying it's not a skill unless I click something for 300 hours and get to 99, and other players saying, well, no, I want this fun activity. I think that there's obviously the sort of boss things are probably, they're kind of mini games, but are they? I think it's probably safe to say that they're mini game-esque. I remember having this discussion, trying to have this discussion with players and also a bit internally, but the framing of content sometimes determines whether it's a skilling boss or a mini game. If Guardians of the Rift had a portal that you were damaging instead of charging a Guardian, and the portal maybe wasn't a portal, but this sort of head, this abyssal head that you were damaging, and it was I don't know, spitting out these creatures, you would suddenly get the idea of, ooh, that's got a personality and entity. I see the target. Now it feels like that's a boss instead of a mini game, and context is super important on that kind of thing. So I guess I get the point that you're making. I think that we've definitely tried to evolve on the strategy of people still refer to Guardians of the Rift as Runecraft Todd, which I could see where Temperos has similarities in gameplay with the collect resources, put them into object that shoots boss. We definitely tried to with Guardians of the Rift to make it feel more like a traditional Runecraft loop. I think one of the things I was really happy about with Guardians of the Rift from a design perspective was that we made you actually go to the altar, so it still feels connected to the world and it's not an instance. But yeah, I get the point you're making. I think we've done other pieces of content to make things more fun that aren't. I think a lot of people like Herbivore. I think minigame just automatically feels more fast-paced than traditional skilling tends to be.
And from my point of view, I definitely feel you on that one. It's been incredibly hard going through this whole process with, the surveys and things like that, and people telling you, we want a fun skill, and then when you present something that seems fun and it's almost too fun, a lot of people feel like that's a bit too alien. So we have to strike that balance and make sure that there's enough for everyone. But it's definitely a balancing act. Thanks, Walrus. I'll move you to the audience if that's okay.
Good talking to you again.
Cheers. Nice to see you again. Bye. All right. We have like 7 minutes, so I'll bring in Valdavon.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. What's up?
Hey, I think one of the things that would really make the distinction between a skill and a minigame, and this sort of ties into the reward structure, is the incentives to go out to sea. So, like wanting to go to an island because there's really good stuff there versus wanting to go to an island because an NPC at the port has given you a contract to go and collect something there or deliver something there. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about how the incentives fit into the core gameplay loop and what your thoughts are there.
I think that I'm trying to think the best way to answer the question, because I guess I don't really see if you gain the ability to unlock an island and you're doing content on the island, that's necessarily feeling like a mini game. I think if that was the point you were making, I think I would disagree on that.
Yeah, so the point that I'm making, I think, is that like the gameplay loop will feel much more skill-like if there's a bunch of islands out at sea that have really cool things that you want to do on them, and you plan a course, depending on your sailing level, what parts of the sea and what islands you have access to. You plan a course based on which of those islands appeal to you versus having some sort of taskmaster at the port that says I want you to go here, here, and here, and when you come back, I'm going to give you 20,000 sailing XP or whatever.
Yeah, I get what you mean. I think that in terms of the entire, that's kind of what I described before, with I'm going to leave port, I'm going to do this thing for this person, I'm going to come back and get a chunk of XP. And then if that, I'm also getting reward points, and that ties into a reward shop, and that's how I'm upgrading my ship, that feels very, very mini-game-like to me.
Yes.
Our thought process generally is that we want you to be doing stuff at sea. I don't think that having tasks is necessarily a bad thing. I think that specific implementation of tasks can be very mini-game-like and not so good. So an idea of a task that might be different in terms of sailing would be hey, I want you to go to this port and sort of on this errand for me. And then along the way, you've got all these other sailing things that you're maybe choosing to interact with. You've got that allure of ooh, that's that thing over there. I'm going to see what that is. And that gave me some sailing, that kind of vibe. There might still be a task system that was your reason to go out at port, but there were things at sea that kept your attention. That's just an example of how that specific task system could be made to feel more skill-like. But as far as coming off an island and doing stuff, we have a very clear, sort of unanimous vision internally where things that happen on a ship are sailing content and things that happen off a ship are not. So even if sailing content helps you find an island, once you're now your character on that island, you're not doing sailing content anymore. Sure, the content could be tied and related to sailing. If you were perhaps investigating a shipwreck that had happened on the island or at the coast of the island, clearly it hit the island and sunk or whatever, or just whatever, it was there, and you were investigating it. You might be using all your other skills, and you might be determining stuff, and that content is content for those skills. But it could absolutely be you find a chest in there that has this interesting material that is then used to upgrade your ship, and that's that feedback loop into your ship. And that would not feel mini game like to me at all, even if that's not necessarily a training method for sailing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I agree. I just wanted to hear your thoughts, so thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Val. Really appreciate it. I think we're up to time, really. I don't know if we have time for one more, Husky, but your answers were absolutely great.
Yeah, I do want to preface as well that a lot of my answers, especially on the spot with things like this, are always just here's a dev who's working on the skill and his thought process on a particular topic. I think that's the advantage that blogs can have when we have all these unanimous sort of team opinions on them. So yeah, I guess I find myself second guessing myself when I answer questions like this, and it's I wondered if Elena disagrees with me right now. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think we should make that clear. Is we make decisions as a team, right? Even Elena Husky, the team working on the new skill, speaks to the rest of the team, and we make decisions as a team. So, yeah, hopefully these answers gave a bit more insight, but obviously wait for the blog and the more official kind of communication when that's released, because then we'll have more definite answers for you guys.
I'm gonna, instead of pulling in another person, I'm just gonna fire through some of these questions in the channel that I think we missed. And I'll just give, I apologize, I'd rather answer a large quantity of questions and give sort of shorter, quicker answers so that people feel like they weren't being ignored. I'm gonna put a stop in like 5 minutes or so, so if you're trying to flood the questions, I'm not gonna necessarily stick around longer. I'm sorry, I have a wife that wants to spend time with me this evening. But I'll try and get through as much as I can, just so people feel like they were addressed. Just apologies if the answer is maybe a bit shallow or not as in-depth as maybe more of a Husky tangent around. That's my little preamble forewarning. Will sailing involve PvP in any way? We're not opposed to PvP content in sailing. We don't really identify it as a core part of the skill, especially in like a training way, and more an additional activity that could be involved in sailing. I'm sure at some point we'll be reaching out to players should sailing pass and being, hey, here's an idea for a PvP piece of content for sailing with a more specific design. And what do you think of it? And that would be how it is that way. But we're not opposed to it. We just don't have like a, yes, sailing is absolutely going to be included, or no, sailing is never going to. Will sailing have some kind of gold gain at least? I think sailing has potential to offer gold through activities that you're doing at sea. One of the ideas of sailing at its core to me is I have a ship, and that is a feature that I now have access to, and how can I utilize that ship to make money? I think there are options to explore there in terms of content for sure. And as far as the reward that's unlocked on islands, absolutely. Like once you could reach content, and once you're at that content, you're no longer sailing, but because you had access to sailing, you make gold from that content. Will upgrading your ship construction be part of a skill? Absolutely. Ship upgrades and customization is a heavy part of the skill. It's not going to be how you train it, so you're not going to get XP for building the ship or adding things to your ship. And construction is likely to be the skill that we use for that, although I wouldn't be opposed to if you're, I don't know, building a range on your ship or something, maybe you need a cooking level to use, or a high-tech range or something. I don't know, I'm just spitballing it. Would quick travel be added after completing routes X amount of time? I always like the idea of convenience like this being unlocked to players through work on it. So if you found an island, maybe you're not just instantly quick teleport there, but maybe after doing content on the island, you gained like a tablet that can be added to your glory, and add glory as an option to get there or something like that. I'm never opposed to that kind of stuff. It's hard to say as a promise we would do that for everything, but generally I'm not opposed to that sort of philosophy. Raids 4 in the ocean. We have no current plans as far as what Raids 4 is, but as for raiding content at sea, sounds like a cool pitch and idea. I'd need to see the more fleshed out design myself to know whether I like it, but I'm not opposed. Do you feel like a sandbox style experience in the ocean for sailing could count as a core gameplay loop? I'm not going to try and answer that without the core gameplay loop document. I think that I'll either leak parts of the document and probably say them incorrectly, or like just not really answer that well or in depth that you sort of want from that. So I guess I would just say wait next week. Will there be rigging as part of the starter levels? As in like rigging on a ship? I don't really understand the question, sorry. We covered that one. Will sailing have multiplayer content? It's hard to say exactly what multiplayer elements will be in sailing, which is a very cop-out answer. But generally speaking, being on a ship with your friends and doing content at sea on a ship together sounds fun to me. I think we generally would like to steer away from a meta where you need to have high-level friends that are sailing to get, say, efficient experience rates. I think that would generally be bad design, but is there content you can do with your friends at sea? Sure. I'm not opposed to that. If you have a larger ship, will it be more difficult to navigate? We covered this in navigation, where our general gist is they turn slower and move slower. I think difficult to navigate is kind of up in the air as far as a larger ship can do more is the sort of biggest allure, and that might include more options as far as navigation at sea. Generally, though, the larger your ship is, the more we'd expect you to be sort of assigning some of that work to like crew and that kind of thing. And also, even if a large ship is by its very nature at like a base level, harder to manage,
that's always a fun place for me to explore in terms of upgrades. Like, hey, this thing as a large ship is a pain, and I don't like it. But then you eventually get an upgrade. It's like, oh wow, that made it. That took away that pressure. That was really nice. And it's not about say I'm going to add things that are horrible and eventually make them good. That's not really the design I'm going for. But I do think that having something like not just always the smoothest experience with no obstructions to the player sort of removes things from the game. You eventually, you need to. I'm not going to go into a big challenge in the tool description as far as game design, but generally speaking, games are there to have a challenge, and your ship might be the tool to overcome that, and getting a better tool might make you better at that challenge. But we don't want to remove the challenge entirely. Will there be other skill requirements in order to participate in sailing in the way it's similar to invention? No, we're not going to make it an elite skill. I'm all for someone being 99 sailing and level 1 in all the other skills, except 10 HP, obviously. Will there be some activities that might involve other skills? Potentially. Those are things that we're definitely going to be looking at. I don't think it's a far stretch to say this piece of content requires a fishing and a sailing level to do, and if you're like a sailing pure, you just can't do it. Are there multiple planned core gameplay loops, such as cartography? That's a wait for next week question. Can we have island at a certain level new monster drop items that are hard and much time to get like noted birds instead of doing mole 100 hours? We are probably going to have new content on islands that are unlocked through sailing, and the purpose of that content and what what role it fills in the meta is entirely up to the content and what we pitch to you guys at a later stage. If you guys particularly want a way to get more birds' nests, and that's a pain stake with the players, then I'm sure we could put content in Island that does that. I'm going to avoid the discussion of whether or not I agree that we need better ways to get birds' nests in the game, but maybe look to your hunter skill. I heard it can be pretty good. Will pieces of content already in game be adapted to fit with the sailing skill? For example, instance parts of Bon Voyage and Dragon Slayer. We definitely want to tackle this in lore and integration as far as making sense that the world that we have makes sense for sailing. So there are things like Dragon Slayer. The whole story of that revolves around the player being unable to sail. We want to tackle in lore and integration questions like how does Dragon Slayer make sense in a world where you suddenly now can sail? Are we going to make amendments to the quest, or should we tweak the framing of it, or should we give you the option to sail there instead? We're not entirely sure what those questions are. We've got a lot to talk about internally, but we do plan to cover these kinds of questions in lore and integration. How do you think about the skill and gameplay for mobile-only people? Yes, absolutely. The skill must be trainable on mobile. Similar to though, like other pieces of content in the game, raids are technically possible on mobile, but like I wouldn't advise doing a raid on your mobile. I'm not saying I wouldn't advise doing sailing on your mobile. I think we absolutely want to make there very good and viable methods of sailing gameplay and content on mobile. But don't be surprised if there are activities at sea that are easier to do on desktop. Would probably be the best way of putting that. Covered PvP. I don't know what you mean by tree gnome airships and if you can own one. PvP covered. This is a long question. I'm trying to digest it. Do you expect these sets of actions to be completely unrelated to doing an objective? I'm someone who dislikes Slayer because it feels more like a job than a skill, since a set of actions co-align more with doing a task than skilling. Would you expect sailing to be defined similarly or differently? That sounds like a question that I know we've covered in core gameplay. It's a complex topic. Yeah, I think your question will be answered when we get into core gameplay stuff, which I've said I'm not going to dive into here. Do we need our diving helmets and apparatus, or will the skill provide new methods or equipment for diving? I don't know. Maybe we have a new diving helmets and apparatus. Maybe we require that quest. I think the game is always better when it's an interconnected web of things where, oh, this thing I got from this other thing is useful in this thing. So I think my personal preference is to lean to you needing to already have the diving helmets and apparatus, but I'm fairly certain you can just talk to Murphy and get those back at any time anyway, so that doesn't feel like a huge barrier to lost them. Are developers looking into how sailing skill intertwines with the current skills in the game, i.e. with cutting, fire making, crafting, destruction? Absolutely. The skill should feed back into some skills, and it should also have skills feed into that. It should be a two-way relationship, like a lot of skills have it. I'm not saying that we need sailing plus X and we multiply that out for all 23. Like, I don't know what sailing and attack looks like. That probably doesn't make too much sense. But there is some logical extension to, like, wood cutting and construction, logs and planks, and making the ship. That feels like that makes sense to me. And it's something that we absolutely want to do. Again, lore and integration section should hopefully cover a lot of how that's going to work. And also we'll cover aspects of that in core gameplay, so that'll be next week. Underwater boss whenever we come up with a design for it. Underwater boss could probably exist without sailing as well. We just have an NPC sail you there, but that sounds less fun. Hey guys, will going to islands be part of the core gameplay or a reward separate minigame? We expect it's sort of hard to answer. I kind of addressed this already. Doing content on an island is not sailing gameplay, but it might be part of your sailing gameplay where you discover an island, and that's an exciting part while you're doing sailing content, and then you decide to park your boat at the island to go and explore it, and you've moved away from sailing gameplay, but it is a reward from the content. Next topic is core gameplay. The one after is rewards. I'm fairly certain this will be covered in a lot more detail than after. Are you planning to have sailing require ship upkeep? I think upkeep is a very broad term that feels hard to define with how vague it's put in the question. I think that some amount of ship upkeep makes sense in terms of if your ship gets damaged, do you repair it and stuff? I know one thing we have spoken about internally, we haven't got a concrete design exactly how it works, but it doesn't feel very good to invest all your time into making a big and expensive ship that you're really proud of, and then because it sinks at sea, it's just lost forever. As a game design, that doesn't feel like a very good perspective. Similar to death, maybe you pay, like someone has just retrieved your ship, and it's like, hey, I got your ship here. It's damaged, and either you have it and it costs to repair, or hey, we'll give you your ship back but at a price. I'm just suggesting ideas here. I don't know what that final design looks like, but I think that we generally wouldn't want you to lose your ship. There was a question about whether we abandon the new skill concept and look to making sailing a minigame. I covered this a lot in this, and I really do believe that sailing makes sense to be a skill and is enhanced by being a skill. There's a lot of things that tell me like this should just be a skill in the game. I'm aware that some people have other opinions. I'm hoping the presentation I presented today helps maybe present my case for that and the team's case a lot for that better. But I know some people will still disagree. Early level progression is skipped from many skills to quest rewards. Are there thoughts of using quests to unlock new islands, for example? I think having quests as part of sailing's launch is something I would like to do. I'm aware that they're not necessarily core to, hey, we need to have 3 quests on launch, but I like the idea that you go to an island and you get a quest, or there's a quest given to you somewhere to find an island, and you need a sailing level to maybe find it in the first place, like, you know, a quest that say has a 20 sailing requirement, and then you find this island and you maybe get a bit of extra sailing speed. I'm not opposed to that kind of thing, but these are like nice to haves for me. Husky has covered what is a skill in some depth. I'd be interested to go more depth into answering what is a minigame. I don't think that kind of discussion will necessarily help a lot. It's the argument, like, scientifically, do you try and prove something or do you try and disprove something? Like, hey, I've given a good example of why I believe sailing to be a skill, but I haven't really disproved why it's not a minigame from a scientific perspective. I guess the fact that a minigame is hard to define in the first place, like I already covered, like, is Temporos a minigame or is it a skilling boss? I think it's a very subjective thing, and to disprove something, you need it's easier to prove something on as being more vague, and yeah, I could see that train of thought. I mean, a lot of the whole what is a skill is not about here is a concrete, hard definition of a skill, and look, here's how concretely sailing fits to it. People are subjective in their opinions and stuff, so I think that I generally just believe that the asking like what is a minigame would be harder to answer than what is a skill. We have a lot of minigames that do a lot of very different things in our game, but our skills do tend to be more concrete in what they are, even if the utility skills tend not to be cohesive. I think I've overrun by 13 minutes, and I've only got through about 13 minutes of questions being asked.
That was amazing, Husky.
So,
I'm sure people will appreciate you have a life and a life to go back to. We really appreciate your time.
any questions that came up really soon since I did it. I can't see anything that's major. Ship combat is the one that I think is standing out to me from Glen Coco. Can we use mage range attacks from our ship, or is ship combat purely from ship cannons or facilities? We plan to cover ship combat at a later date. We initially were planning to cover this in core gameplay, and that's actually part of our rework, as we feel like it gets very complex when we talk about the intricacies of combat, and it was detracting from the core gameplay discussion. We're unsure currently whether we do a refinement stage 2.5 that just gives our sort of design of ship combat, or whether we do that as a 5th topic at the end, or we're unsure. We're kind of just we're gonna give some information in core gameplay elements, because we feel like we need to touch on that because it's been a big question, and we'll just kind of see where feedback is at that point, because a lot of our design stuff is determined, like, do we think this is valuable and required before the green light of sailing? One thing I would like to say, at least to answer your question somewhat, is that we do agree on a distinction between combat on a ship and ship combat. Like, we want them to be very distinct things. Like, your ship fires a cannon at a thing should feel very different from you casting your spell at a thing. They're two different things, if that makes sense. So yeah.
Awesome. Fantastic. I guess it's just time to wrap up by saying thank you to everyone who joined us here today with all the nice comments. We see them all and we really, really appreciate them. I'm doing a bit of work to try and like make the Discord a bit more social as well, and just like a place you want to hang out in as well as give your feedback. So if you do want to stick around and just talk in the casual chat, you're more than welcome to. The next week will be really, really busy for us as we just nail down our presentation and design. We have delayed the blog by like about 7 days, so you can expect like updates in the announcements channel about when you can expect the next stage, which will be about core gameplay, and then the blog, etc. So thank you so much for joining us. We really, really appreciate it. If you enjoyed it as well, just make sure to let us know either on Discord or socials, know that these stages are good things to do. I will try to get it uploaded to YouTube, but I'm going to be taking a long weekend, so we'll see if I can